Imagine yourself sitting by a warm fire in the fading light of dusk. The air is still, but you can hear the distant rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional clink of leather as someone prepares their horse for a long ride. This is the world of the American Wild West, a time often filled with tales of rugged cowboys, daring outlaws, and adventurous pioneers. But as you settle into this journey through history, I invite you to let go of the myth and see what life in the West was really like. Far from the idealized version of freedom and fortune, the Wild West was a place of struggle, survival, and hardship. It was a land where poverty was a constant companion, where every day brought new challenges and dangers, and where even the bravest souls were often brought to their knees. This was a world in which the frontier was constantly shifting, and so too were the lives of those who called it home. In this journey, we will explore the hidden lives of cowboys and outlaws, the unsung and often forgotten stories of those who were not immortalized in legend but lived a daily grind that stretched their strength, tested their resolve, and shaped the America we know today. Segment 1. Why it sucked to be a cowboy in the Wild West. Picture yourself waking up before the sun rises, the chill of the morning air biting at your skin. The land around you is vast and empty, stretching out in all directions, with only the occasional tree breaking up the horizon. Your body is stiff from the long hours of riding yesterday, and as you saddle up your horse, you realize that another long, exhausting day lies ahead. Being a cowboy in the Wild West was far from the romanticized idea of adventure that we often hear about. The life of a cowboy was grueling, lonely, and often unrewarding. From the moment the sun broke the horizon to the time it sank again, you were on the move. There were no days off, no easy hours. It was a constant battle against the land, the weather, and the animals under your care. Your job was to herd cattle across hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles. The cattle drives were long, often lasting for weeks, with no guarantee of success. The heat during the summer was unbearable, and the dust would clog your lungs as you rode tirelessly, day after day. You'd find little rest, only short moments of sleep around campfires that barely kept the chill at bay. And the pay? It was meager, often not enough to cover the barest of expenses. Cowboys were paid in a way that ensured they were perpetually in debt to the ranch owners, forever trying to catch up with what they owed. For all the hardship, all the endless hours spent in the saddle, a cowboy might earn just enough to scrape by, if he was lucky. You might think that the life of a cowboy was one of freedom, but that freedom came at a steep price. Cowboys were expected to follow orders, to keep the cattle moving forward, and to fight off threats from every direction, whether it was hostile Native American tribes, aggressive wild animals, or other bands of lawless men. The constant danger was never far behind. At any moment, a rustler might attempt to steal your cattle, or you might find yourself in a shootout with someone who wanted what you had. Life in the Wild West wasn't about riding across endless plains under a vast sky. It was about hard work, constant vigilance, and the overwhelming fatigue that followed each day. Yet, despite these struggles, cowboys pushed on. They had little choice but to endure, because survival depended on their perseverance. And when the cattle were finally delivered to market, and the long drive was over, there was little time to rest, only to start preparing for the next one. As you listen, imagine yourself in this time. The sun beginning to set, your body aching, but you press on because that's the only choice you have. You are a cowboy, and this is your life. As you sit by the fire, the night deepens around you. The crackle of the flames dances in the quiet darkness, and you may find yourself wondering about the legends of the Wild West, the gunfighters, the quick draws, the showdowns. You've heard the stories, perhaps seen the movies, but what was the truth behind the mythology of these so-called fastest guns in the West? The truth is, gunfights in the Old West were far less common than popular media would have us believe. The reality of being a gunfighter wasn't as glamorous as it's made out to be. Most of the time, a gunman's work was done behind the scenes, mysterious, quiet, and often accompanied by a fair bit of suffering. Imagine yourself standing in a small, dusty town. The air is dry, and there's a tension in the atmosphere, an unsaid promise that violence could erupt at any moment. But these standoffs were rarer than you might think. In fact, the iconic gunfight was often the result of escalating conflict that had been simmering beneath the surface for months, sometimes years. Unlike the flash of bullets in an afternoon duel, these encounters were drawn out, filled with warnings, negotiations, and threats. Take, for example, the famous shootout at the Corral, often cited as the epitome of Old West violence. The actual fight lasted only 30 seconds. It was messy, chaotic, and not nearly as elegant or heroic as we've come to imagine. People were injured, shot in confusion, and the outcome didn't lead to any immediate resolution, just a cloud of dust, a few more graves, and a town left to pick up the pieces. The reality of gunfighters was that many were just ordinary men who had developed a reputation either out of necessity, or as a result of the circumstances in which they found themselves. A man may have been forced into violence to defend himself, his property, or his honor, and in the dangerous environment of the frontier, that violence became a currency. Those who were skilled with a pistol became known, sometimes feared, but most gunmen weren't the heroes we imagine today. They weren't heroes at all, but rather men hardened by survival, gripped by the need for self-preservation in a land where few could afford the luxury of being soft-hearted. As you sit here, consider this: the gunfighters weren't just outlaws and villains. Many were men with broken pasts, men who had seen more violence than most people could endure, and those who had little else to rely on but their speed with a gun. The harsh realities of the frontier did not make heroes out of men. It made survivors. They weren't quick-draw artists. They were desperate individuals whose weapons were not only tools of self-defense but also symbols of fear and power. The skill of the gunfighter was as much about staying alive in a violent and unforgiving land as it was about putting on a show for the public. Their guns were their livelihood and their protection, not the badges of a mythic legend. A famous gunslinger like Billy the Kid or Wild Bill Hickok had his moments of fame, but their lives were tangled in constant flight, hidden faces, and eventual early deaths. These men were hunted, much like the prey they had once pursued. There was nothing romantic about it. In the end, most gunfighters didn't die in dramatic duels. Instead, they were more likely to fall victim to a sudden ambush, a quiet betrayal, or a poorly aimed shot in the dark. Their names and faces may have lived on in tales, but those tales often blurred the line between reality and fantasy. And so, as you sit with the crackling of the fire and feel the quiet of the night wrap around you, think on this. The true gunfighters of the Old West lived lives filled with tension and uncertainty, not just legend. They were men born of circumstance, and their reputations grew not from single shots in the street, but from years of living with violence as a constant shadow over their heads. As the night grows deeper, the fire now reduced to glowing embers, you may feel a sense of intrigue rising in the air. It's a quiet, almost magnetic pull, an allure of mysteries that have remained unsolved for generations. One such mystery lies hidden in the rugged hills of the Wild West, the lost gold mines. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a dry, barren landscape, the sun setting low in the sky, casting long shadows over jagged rocks and dusty plains. This land is unforgiving, yet beneath its surface, there are rumors, whispers of vast riches buried deep within the mountains. Gold. An unimaginable fortune hidden in mines, lost to time and forgotten by most. Yet, every so often, someone would come along, claiming to have found the key to this treasure, only to disappear, their secrets vanishing with them. The lost gold mines of the Wild West have captured the imagination of treasure hunters, adventurers, and hopeful souls for generations. From the 1800s onwards, tales of vast gold reserves hidden in remote corners of the West swirled through the frontier. Yet, despite numerous attempts, no one has ever truly confirmed the location of these mythical riches. One of the most enduring stories involves the legendary Lost Dutchman's Mine in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona. For years, prospectors have searched for it, drawn by a single promise: unimaginable wealth, buried deep within the rocky crags of the mountains. The story goes that a German prospector, Jacob Waltz, discovered a rich vein of gold in the mountains in the 1860s. But before he could share the secret with anyone, he died, taking the location of the mine with him. He told a few trusted confidants, but those who went looking for the treasure never returned. The mountains, they say, are cursed. Others have gone looking for other mines, some still believed to be somewhere in the desert, hidden from view. There's talk of the Lost San Saba mine, another fabled location said to contain a vast fortune, abandoned after Spanish explorers first discovered it in the 1700s. But despite countless searches, no one has ever returned with solid evidence of its existence. Some claim to have found traces of the mine, only to fall victim to the harsh desert environment. The truth remains elusive. But what makes these mines so mysterious? Some argue that the idea of a treasure, hidden from the world, taps into a deeply rooted yearning for escape from the struggles of daily life. For many cowboys, outlaws, and even settlers, the promise of gold was the one thing that could offer a reprieve from the hardships of the frontier. It symbolized freedom from debt, an end to the endless toil of working the land, and a future that was untethered from struggle. Yet, for all the hopeful stories, the lost gold mines were more often a trap than a treasure. The harsh conditions of the land, extreme heat, scarce water, and treacherous terrain, meant that those who ventured in search of these riches often paid a heavy price. Many perished from exhaustion, illness, or from falling victim to the merciless landscape. It's said that some of those who searched never came back at all, swallowed by the wilderness, their bones scattered among the rocks. But what of the men and women who swore they had seen the gold with their own eyes? Were they simply victims of delusion, driven mad by the harshness of the land? Or did they stumble upon something truly remarkable, an almost mythical treasure hidden away in a forgotten corner of the West, lost forever to time? Perhaps the allure of these mines isn't just about the gold itself. It's about the idea of finding something in a place that was never meant to give. It's the same pull that has drawn explorers for centuries, to search for something beyond the known, something that holds the promise of wonder, wealth, and mystery. But sometimes, the more we search, the more the mystery deepens. In the quiet of the night, as the fire burns low, consider this: maybe the lost gold mines aren't just about treasure. Maybe they're about the spirit of the frontier itself, full of hope, promise, and the endless pursuit of something more, even when the journey seems fruitless. As the firelight flickers, casting shadows across the walls, you may begin to sense the deeper complexities of the Wild West. Beyond the legends of gallant cowboys and fearsome outlaws, there was a much quieter, more persistent struggle, one not always told in tales of shootouts and cattle rustlers. It was the clash between cowboys and farmers, a quiet war fought not with gunfire, but with disputes over land, livelihood, and the very future of the West. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a wide stretch of land. To one side, there's the rough, open range, dotted with scattered cattle. To the other, a neat, orderly patchwork of crops, stretching out towards the horizon. This was the battleground, a frontier of competing ideals. The cowboys of the West were the symbol of rugged individualism. They roamed freely across the plains, guiding cattle from one grazing area to the next, constantly on the move, bound only by the limits of the land itself. They were men of the open range, where the wind never seemed to stop, and the horizon was always just a little too far to reach. They valued freedom above all else, and their lives were defined by the rhythm of their cattle drives, the horses they rode, and the land that was both their livelihood and their prison. But the farmers, those who began to stake their claims in the mid-19th century, had a very different vision. For them, the land was to be tamed and cultivated, worked and settled in neat rows. The steady life of planting crops and harvesting was in stark contrast to the cowboy's wandering existence. For the farmer, land was ownership, security, and the promise of a future rooted in family, community, and growth. The homestead was a place of stability, everything cowboys lacked. As the 19th century wore on, tensions between these two groups mounted. The cattle were taking up too much space, grazing on land that was needed for crops. The farmers had little tolerance for cattle roaming freely and destroying their fields, trampling crops and tearing down fences. And the cowboys, for their part, were just as suspicious of the farmers, seeing them as interlopers who were trying to confine the free, wild nature of the frontier into neat parcels of land. In towns like Dodge City, Kansas, the friction between these two groups often boiled over into violence. The cowboys, seeing their cattle as a lifeline, fought to keep their herds on the move, and the farmers, struggling to establish their claims, fought to protect their crops and land. It wasn't uncommon for tensions to escalate into gunfights, land disputes, and outright warfare. In fact, the very idea of the cowboy is wrapped in this notion of a free-roaming spirit constantly at odds with the incoming tide of settlement and agriculture. Farmers brought with them a sense of permanence that was unsettling to the cowboy. They started fencing off land, and the open range began to shrink. The invention of barbed wire in the 1870s, which allowed farmers to fence their land cheaply and efficiently, marked a significant turning point. With fences rising up, cowboys could no longer let their cattle roam freely. The wide open spaces of the West were beginning to close in, and the cowboy way of life, which had thrived in the vast, untamed lands, was beginning to fade. But it wasn't just about land, it was about the future. Farmers, with their settled lifestyles, represented the push for civilization, industry, and progress. They wanted to tame the land and make it productive, to build communities and towns that would last for generations. The cowboys, in contrast, represented a dying era, a time when the land had been wild, a time of independence, where survival meant being free of ties and obligations. The conflict between these two groups, cowboys and farmers, didn't end with a single resolution. It was a slow, drawn-out struggle, the result of different visions for the future of the American West. Farmers slowly gained the upper hand as more settlers arrived, and cowboys found themselves increasingly pushed off the land they had once roamed so freely. With the advent of railroads and the rise of agriculture, the frontier was being reshaped. The cowboys' days of roaming the range came to an end, and the land was divided, fenced in, and settled. And so, as the firelight flickers and the night deepens around you, think about this. The cowboy wasn't just a symbol of freedom. He was a man living on borrowed time, struggling against forces larger than himself, forces that sought to change the very landscape of the West. And as the farmer tilled his land, planting seeds for a future of stability, the cowboy was left behind, a relic of a time that was vanishing with each passing day. As the night settles in and the crackling of the fire begins to soften, imagine yourself walking through the dusty streets of a small frontier town. The air is thick with the scent of dry earth, and you can hear the occasional creak of wooden signs swaying in the wind. The town is quiet for now, but you know it's a fragile piece, as each day brings new challenges. A sheriff's job in such a place was never simple, and tonight, you'll step into the boots of one, a man tasked with keeping the law in a land where lawlessness often reigned supreme. Being a sheriff in a frontier town was no easy task. The job was far from glamorous. Unlike the lawmen of Hollywood films, real sheriffs in the Wild West were often poorly paid, working in towns with few resources and little support. They were the ones called upon when trouble arose, which was frequent. Whether it was an altercation at the local saloon, a cattle rustler causing trouble, or an outlaw looking to lay low, the sheriff had to be ready to face whatever came his way. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. With no formal training, and few resources at his disposal, the sheriff was often a man of limited means. His badge, while symbolizing authority, was more of a burden than a shield. He had to keep the peace not with the support of a robust police force, but with the help of a few deputies, some trusted locals, and his own wits. Each day brought a new challenge, and there was no such thing as a typical day in a frontier town. You might be called to break up a bar fight that's turned violent, only to find that the men involved have no intention of backing down. Or perhaps you've received word that a notorious outlaw is hiding out in the town, and you must decide how to approach him, knowing full well that a confrontation could lead to bloodshed. The sheriff's days were spent walking the fine line between maintaining order and navigating the dangers of a place where violence could erupt at any moment. Often, he had to deal with problems that were beyond his control. Ranchers encroaching on one another's land, disputes over water rights, or arguments between miners and local farmers. But while the sheriff may have been the town's appointed lawman, his authority was often questioned. In many towns, justice was a matter of personal opinion, and what was legal or right was far from clear. The sheriff's life was often lonely, as well. Many of these men were far from family and friends, stationed in towns that were isolated from the rest of the world. The job itself was isolating, too. It demanded constant vigilance, and often the sheriff would spend long hours alone, pacing the streets, keeping watch over the townspeople. He couldn't afford to rest. He knew that at any moment, trouble could arise, and he had to be ready. There were moments of danger, too. The sheriff was a target for outlaws, who would see him as a threat to their business, and sometimes even the people he protected. A shootout might happen unexpectedly, as an outlaw tried to escape or someone looked to settle an old score. And when that moment came, the sheriff had to act quickly and decisively, knowing that hesitation could cost him his life. Yet, despite the hardships, there was a certain pride in the sheriff's role. He was the protector of the town, the figure who held the delicate balance between chaos and order. The residents of the town relied on him, and although they might not always show it, they knew the sheriff was the one keeping the worst elements at bay. There was a certain honor in the role, but it was earned through tireless effort and often at great personal cost. At the end of a long day, the sheriff might return to his small office, the weight of his responsibilities hanging heavy on his shoulders. The peace he had fought to maintain, however fragile, might last for only a short time before the next challenge emerged. The law of the frontier was never fully in control, and the sheriff's job was one of constant vigilance, filled with moments of tension and uncertainty. So, as the fire flickers and the quiet surrounds you, think about the sheriffs of the Old West, those who wore badges not as symbols of power, but as heavy burdens. Their lives were defined by their commitment to maintaining order in a place where lawlessness reigned. They were not celebrated heroes but ordinary men doing extraordinary work, often in the face of overwhelming odds. As the fire dims, casting a soft glow across your surroundings, a quiet, often overlooked aspect of frontier life begins to emerge: the women of the Wild West. When we think of the Old West, we often imagine strong, rugged men riding the open plains, battling outlaws, and striking gold. But behind every cowboy, every miner, and every settler, there was often a woman, working just as hard, enduring just as much, though often forgotten in the tales of legend. Picture yourself in a small, bustling frontier town. The men may dominate the saloon, the barroom brawls, and the dramatic showdowns, but the women are the ones who keep the town together. They were the ones who cleaned the homes, cared for the children, cooked meals over wood stoves, and kept the social fabric of the community intact. Theirs was a life filled with daily chores, constant labor, and little recognition. The journey westward was difficult for everyone, but for women, it was especially so. Many women traveled across the country with their husbands, families, or on their own, facing the long, dangerous trip with little support. Upon arrival, they had to set up households, often in the harshest of conditions. Homes were small, crude, and offered little comfort. Women had to make do with what little they had, using their resourcefulness and endurance to create a semblance of stability in the wild, untamed landscape. In the rural areas, women were expected to work just as hard as the men. They cooked meals for the family, tended gardens, and cared for livestock. When sickness struck, they acted as nurses and caregivers. They were often the ones to sew clothes, make soap, and do everything necessary to keep the family alive and functioning. There were few luxuries, and comforts were few and far between. In many ways, the land itself dictated the pace of life, and women had to adjust, adapting to the rhythms of farming, ranching, and frontier living. But there were also women who defied the typical role expected of them. In the saloons of mining towns, women worked as dancers, waitresses, or even as entertainers, navigating a world of hard men, rough living, and constant danger. These women were often seen as outcasts by society, their roles not fully understood or accepted, yet they were essential to the functioning of the town. They lived in precarious positions, often subject to the whims of powerful men, yet they also held a certain power of their own, commanding respect, sometimes fear, in the saloons and gambling halls. In the more settled communities, women also took on roles that were essential to survival. They taught children, held social gatherings, and formed the backbone of the school systems in places where education was a luxury. They played a crucial role in the church services and often led the community in charity work. providing aid to the sick, the elderly, and the poor. These women were the unseen forces, their work often invisible to the world outside, but vital to the survival and growth of the town. Despite the harshness of life on the frontier, some women thrived in their new roles. There are stories of women who ran businesses, took control of ranches, and even fought in the West's infamous gunfights. Their resilience and courage became part of the fabric of the frontier, though their stories were often overshadowed by the more dramatic accounts of men. One famous example is Calamity Jane, who became known for her bravery and her association with Wild Bill Hickok. Though her reputation has become somewhat romanticized, she was one of many women who refused to live by the rules of society and forged their own paths. Yet, for many, the reality of frontier life was far from glamorous. Women in these towns often lived in isolation, away from the comforts and support systems of the East. Family ties were strained, and isolation bred a certain quiet despair. Women struggled with the loneliness of being far from family, with the exhaustion of endless chores, and with the constant threat of illness and danger. But they carried on, because survival in the Wild West was not a choice, but a necessity. As the fire crackles softly in the background, consider this. While the Wild West is often celebrated as a time of men blazing new trails, it was equally shaped by the unseen hands of women. Their quiet, steady work, the cooking, the cleaning, the caring, built the communities of the West, while their courage, resilience, and adaptability paved the way for new roles in a rapidly changing society. As the night deepens, the fire's glow flickers softly, and the quiet hum of the world outside fills the air. The frontier was a place full of ambition and risk, where individuals sought to carve out their own destinies, some by hard work, others by defiance of the law. And it is the outlaws, like Jesse James, who have become the enduring symbols of this defiance. Their names echo through history, their stories shaped by myth and legend. But what was the truth behind the famous names that lived by their guns? Imagine yourself walking the dust-filled streets of a small frontier town, where the scent of gunpowder still lingers in the air after a confrontation, and the shadow of an outlaw's name hangs over the town like a cloud. Outlaws were often seen as rebels, romanticized by the press and the public as figures who stood against the system, who fought for freedom or revenge in a land where lawlessness ran rampant. But in truth, life as an outlaw was far from glamorous. It was a life of constant danger, betrayal, and fleeting moments of triumph before inevitable defeat. Jesse James is one of the most infamous names of the Old West, but the man behind the myth was not the bold, heroic figure he is often portrayed as. Born in 1847, Jesse James grew up in Missouri, a region deeply affected by the chaos of the Civil War. His family's involvement in the war created a strong sense of loyalty to the Confederate cause, and Jesse became deeply disillusioned by the post-war years, during which he and his brother Frank turned to a life of crime. They, along with their gang, began a series of bank robberies, train heists, and other illegal activities, all of which were marked by a bloody trail of violence. Jesse James was not a modern-day Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor, despite the legend that surrounds him. In fact, the James Younger gang's robberies were primarily motivated by greed, with little concern for the well-being of those they left in their wake. Their crimes often resulted in the deaths of innocent people, and they became notorious for their ruthlessness. What made Jesse James stand out, however, was not just his criminal activity, but his ability to evade capture for so long. The public, fascinated by his audacity and ability to outwit the law, began to romanticize him. Newspapers published sensational stories about his exploits, and over time, he became an almost mythic figure. The truth of his life was lost in the haze of these tales, and Jesse James became the symbol of the outlaw hero, someone who stood against an unjust system, even if that meant breaking the law. But as we reflect on his story, the truth becomes clear. Jesse James's life was one of constant fear and evasion. While the legend paints him as a man of honor and defiance, the reality was much darker. He lived in hiding, constantly on the run from lawmen who were just as determined to bring him to justice as he was to maintain his freedom. His gang was disbanded after a series of failed robberies, and his own downfall came in the form of a bullet, fired by a member of his own gang, Robert Ford, in 1882, as Jesse adjusted a picture on the wall. His death, in many ways, was a fitting end to a life filled with deception and betrayal. The cowboy who lived by the gun ultimately fell by it. The legacy of Jesse James, like that of many outlaws, is both romanticized and tragic. He wasn't the noble man of legend, nor the hero that many believed him to be. He was a product of his time, shaped by violence, the chaos of war, and the unforgiving landscape of the Wild West. His story, as told over the years, is a testament to the allure of rebellion, but it is also a reminder of the cost of living outside the law. In the stillness of the night, as the fire burns low, think about this. The outlaws like Jesse James are often remembered for their defiance and their daring, but their lives were fraught with danger and despair. The legacy they left behind wasn't one of freedom, but of fleeting moments of notoriety, before the inevitable end came. They were not the heroes of the West, but its tragic figures, whose stories became legends more than men. As the night stretches on and the flickering light of the fire softens, the vast, quiet expanse of the frontier begins to shift. In the romanticized stories of cowboys and outlaws, there is often a silence, a gap where the voices and lives of the Native Americans, the original inhabitants of the land, should be. In this segment, we will explore the complex and often painful realities of their existence during the height of the Wild West era. Imagine yourself walking on the land, the sun hanging low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains. The land stretches out in front of you, the same land that has been home to indigenous peoples for centuries. For Native Americans, the Wild West wasn't a place of conquest. It was their home, a place where they lived in harmony with the land, their cultures rich with traditions, beliefs, and histories that stretched back long before the arrival of settlers. But this was also a time when that world was under siege. As settlers poured into the West, driven by the promise of land and opportunity, the Native American way of life was threatened with extinction. The U.S. government, supported by the growing tide of expansionism, sought to push Native peoples off their ancestral lands, often by force. Wars were fought, treaties were signed, and promises were broken. The lives of Native Americans in the Wild West were defined by their resistance to this encroachment, but also by their vulnerability in the face of a rapidly changing world. The early 19th century saw the arrival of settlers, traders, and soldiers, all of whom began to carve up the land. This was followed by the forced relocation of entire tribes, like the Cherokee, who were marched thousands of miles along the infamous Trail of Tears. Though not as widely known as some of the later conflicts, the earlier years of the frontier saw constant tension between Native Americans and settlers. Tribes such as the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, and Comanche, who had thrived in the West for centuries, suddenly found themselves forced into smaller and smaller spaces. Despite these pressures, Native American tribes fought to protect their way of life. They resisted with strength, strategy, and remarkable bravery. The most famous of these resistances was the conflict between the U.S. Army and the Plains Indians, who were trying to protect their hunting grounds, their sacred sites, and their way of life. The battle at Little Bighorn, where General Custer and his troops were defeated by a coalition of Native American tribes, is one of the most well-known, but it was just one of many instances of Native American resistance against overwhelming odds. Yet, for all their bravery, Native American resistance was ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer number of settlers, the might of the U.S. Army, and the relentless pressure to assimilate. The government's policy of forcing Native Americans onto reservations, areas far removed from their ancestral lands, was a tool used to control and destroy their culture. These reservations were often located in arid, barren lands unsuitable for agriculture, leaving Native Americans struggling to survive in a landscape that offered little hope. The buffalo, which had long been central to Native American culture and livelihood, was nearly wiped out during this period, further decimating their way of life. For the Native American families who lived in these communities, life on the reservations was one of hardship and loss. Children were often sent to boarding schools where they were forced to abandon their native languages and traditions. Native Americans were stripped of their identities and forced to assimilate into a society that viewed them as inferior. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Native American way of life was radically altered. The U.S. government had succeeded in pushing most Native American tribes off their lands, confining them to reservations, and erasing much of their cultural heritage. But despite the overwhelming adversity they faced, Native American communities did not disappear. They endured, and their stories continue to shape the American landscape to this day. In this quiet moment, as the flames flicker softly and the vast wilderness around you becomes still, think on this. The history of the Wild West cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the experiences of Native Americans. Their struggles, their resistance, and their survival are an indelible part of the story, a story that continues, woven into the fabric of the land, even as the frontier fades into myth. As the fire's glow begins to dim, a new scene emerges, a place where people, in their desperation, sought their fortunes in the unyielding earth. The sound of pickaxes striking stone, the clang of metal, and the murmur of hard labor fills the air. The life of a miner in the Wild West was one of ambition, but also of hardship and constant peril. It was a life that many believed would lead them to untold riches, but for most, it only led to exhaustion, disease, and broken dreams. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a mining town, the sun beginning to set behind the jagged hills that surround it. Dust swirls in the air, mixing with the acrid scent of sulfur and the smell of sweat that clings to the bodies of the men and women who work tirelessly beneath the unforgiving sun. The town is rough, barely a collection of shacks and tents, but it's alive with the frantic energy of those who believe that the earth holds their salvation: gold, silver, copper, or coal. Life in a mining town was grueling. The labor was unrelenting, the hours long, and the rewards, for the most part, elusive. Many men came to these towns with the hope of striking it rich, of finding a rich vein of gold or silver that would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. They worked in the mines, digging, tunneling, and scraping away at the earth, hoping to uncover something valuable. But most of the time, what they uncovered was dirt, rocks, and more dirt. The work was dirty, dangerous, and monotonous, yet the promise of wealth kept them going. For those who didn't work in the mines themselves, there were other ways to make a living. The town became a place of merchants, saloons, and gambling halls, where the fortune seekers came to blow whatever little they earned. The saloon was often the heart of the town, a place where miners could spend their evenings drinking, gambling, and seeking escape from the harsh realities of their work. The smell of cheap liquor mixed with the dust of the day, and the sounds of laughter and shouting filled the air as men tried to shake off the exhaustion of the mines. But the town's allure wasn't only in its potential for wealth. It was also in its lawlessness. In mining towns, there was little in the way of law enforcement, and violence was a constant threat. Fights broke out over mining claims, over money, and over women. The absence of formal authority meant that many miners took the law into their own hands, leading to a constant undercurrent of tension that made these towns dangerous places to live. Vigilantes often made their own rules, and the weak, without power or protection, were left vulnerable. Health was another pressing issue in these towns. Disease spread quickly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Sicknesses like tuberculosis and cholera took lives every year, leaving behind a trail of grief and despair. The lack of medical care meant that many miners and townspeople died without proper treatment. The air in the mines was thick with dust and dangerous chemicals, and the men who worked in the tunnels often faced lung diseases that would slowly eat away at their bodies. Despite the danger, the hope for a better life drove many to continue, risking their health, and often their lives, in pursuit of an elusive fortune. There was also a deep sense of isolation in the mining towns. Families, too, would often live in the squalid conditions, sharing small spaces, and trying to make a home in the midst of chaos. But women in these towns were often few, and many were forced into roles that were harshly shaped by the environment around them. Many worked in saloons or as cooks and laundresses, just as hard as the men, but their labor was often overlooked and unappreciated. But what happened when the gold didn't come? When the mine ran dry, or the claim was proven worthless? In many cases, the miners simply packed up and moved on, seeking the next town, the next mine, the next dream. The life of a miner was one of constant movement, always looking for the next big find, but often walking away with nothing more than the dust of failure on their boots. For those who stayed, life in the mining town became one of quiet desperation. As the years wore on, the once thriving communities would fade. Towns would crumble as the mines ran dry, and the workers left, seeking new fortunes elsewhere. What remained was often a collection of empty buildings, reminders of the dreams that were never realized. And so, as the night grows quiet around you, consider this: the mining towns of the Wild West were places of intense labor and hope, where fortunes could be made and lost in the blink of an eye. They were a microcosm of the Wild West itself, filled with promise, but built on the fragile hope of finding something precious buried deep beneath the surface. As the evening winds down, the fire now only a faint glow in the distance, a new perspective begins to unfold, a perspective often hidden beneath the dust and chaos of frontier life. For all the rough, rugged individuals who sought their fortunes in the West, there was another, quieter class, those who thrived not on the open range or in the mines, but in the burgeoning towns and cities. They were the elite of the Wild West, the businessmen, the landowners, the politicians, and the entrepreneurs who saw opportunity in the chaos and built fortunes that would last long after the frontier closed. Imagine yourself entering one of the larger towns that dotted the frontier, perhaps Denver or San Francisco in the 1860s. The streets here are not filled with cattle or miners, but with well-dressed individuals, women in fine gowns and men in tailored suits. The air smells of fresh lumber and freshly baked bread, and the sounds of a thriving community fill your ears. This is a world far removed from the hardships of the cowboy or the miner. Here, the elite of the West were shaping a new kind of society, one based on commerce, land speculation, and growing industries. Life for the elite in the Wild West was about control over land, resources, and the people who worked for them. Many of the wealthiest men in these towns made their fortunes by capitalizing on the rapid expansion of railroads, gold mining, and cattle ranching. They built railroads that stretched across the continent, profiting from the transportation of goods and people. They owned vast stretches of land and built sprawling ranches, often employing hundreds of men and women to work the land for them. These elite businessmen were the ones who shaped the economy of the frontier. They were the ones who made the decisions, who held the power. Unlike the cowboys and miners who were at the mercy of nature and fate, the wealthy had the luxury of living in opulent homes, attending lavish parties, and enjoying the fruits of the rapidly expanding economy. Their wealth allowed them to shield themselves from the harsh realities of life on the frontier, even as they profited from the hard work of those who lived in more difficult circumstances. In the saloons, the elite were often seen as the patrons, those who could afford the fine whiskey and the best seats in the house. They were not the ones who drank and gambled away their paychecks, but the ones who owned the establishments and made the deals. Politics and business were closely intertwined, with the wealthiest men often holding positions of power in local governments, or using their influence to sway decisions in their favor. For women in the elite class, life in the Wild West was still shaped by the social norms of the time, but they were afforded opportunities that were rare in other parts of the country. Wealthy women might own land or run businesses, often behind the scenes, but still contributing significantly to the success of their families. Many women in the elite class were involved in social causes, supporting churches, schools, and charities. They might host social events that brought together the most influential individuals in town, shaping the culture of the emerging frontier cities. Yet, even for the elite, life on the frontier was not without its difficulties. There were constant threats of economic instability, political conflict, and competition from other landowners or business people. Wealth was never guaranteed, and even the most successful businessmen had to contend with the unpredictable nature of the frontier. Indian raids, cattle rustling, and labor strikes were all very real concerns, and the elite had to maintain their wealth and power while also ensuring their own protection. As the frontier began to close at the end of the 19th century, many of these elite figures moved east, taking their fortunes with them. They left behind a legacy of towns and cities that would eventually become major hubs of industry and commerce, shaped by the wealth and influence of the individuals who had seized the opportunities of the Wild West. But even as they left, the marks of their success remained: railroads, towns, institutions, and wealth that would last long into the future. The elite of the Wild West were not the iconic figures that populate the stories of cowboys and outlaws, but they were the ones who truly shaped the American West. They were the architects of the future, quietly laying the groundwork for the transformation of the frontier into the modern, prosperous society we know today. So, as the embers of the fire burn low and the world around you grows still, reflect on this. The elite of the Wild West were the hidden figures in the drama of frontier life. They were the ones who, through vision and power, built the cities and industries that would eventually tame the land and turn the West into something more than a myth. As the fire fades to embers, a gentle breeze whispers through the night. Now, imagine yourself on the edge of a vast and uncharted landscape, where the only means of transportation between far-flung towns was a sturdy stagecoach. The rhythmic sound of hooves pounding against the earth and the creaking of the wooden wheels are the soundtrack of a journey across the unforgiving Wild West. As a stagecoach driver, your job was not just to transport passengers, but to navigate the treacherous, unpredictable conditions of the frontier, fraught with danger at every turn. Being a stagecoach driver was a dangerous and often thankless job. You didn't just have to contend with the elements, but with the constant threat of attack, whether from bandits, hostile Native American groups, or wild animals. The routes taken by stagecoaches were long, often traveling through rugged, isolated areas where help was far away, and the terrain could shift from arid desert to dense, unpredictable forests. One mistake, one wrong turn, and the entire coach could end up in peril. Imagine yourself seated atop a stagecoach, reins tightly in hand, as you guide the horses along a winding, narrow trail. The air is thick with dust, and the wind stings your face. The stagecoach is heavily loaded with passengers, each one depending on you to get them to their destinations safely. But the road ahead is not just uncertain, it is fraught with peril. Stagecoach routes, particularly those running through remote areas of the West, were prime targets for highwaymen and outlaws. These robbers knew that the stagecoach was carrying valuable cargo, mail, money, or sometimes precious goods, and that it would be traveling on predictable paths. Bandits would lie in wait, planning to ambush the coach, hoping to steal whatever they could. And when an ambush occurred, it wasn't just about the loss of goods. It was about the lives at risk, the passengers, the driver, the guard, and the horses. You, as the driver, were trained to respond quickly in such situations. The weight of responsibility rested heavily on your shoulders. Not only were you steering the horses, but you were also protecting your passengers, often with little more than a whip and quick thinking. If an attack came, your first task was to keep the horses under control, ensuring that they didn't bolt, as terrified animals could easily run the stagecoach off course, into ravines or against rocky outcrops. The danger of being thrown from the stagecoach, or of crashing into a canyon, was a constant threat. But that wasn't the only risk. The long hours spent on the road meant constant exposure to the elements. The heat of the day was exhausting, the cold of the night brutal. You had little respite, stopping only when absolutely necessary, and then only for short periods. There were few comforts in this life. You were often on your own, navigating terrain you hadn't seen before, finding shelter in makeshift camps that did little to shield you from the relentless conditions. And if you survived the attacks and the elements, there was still the danger of the road itself. Dips, rocks, and washouts could turn a smooth journey into a hazardous one. A misstep in the trail could lead to broken wheels, overturned coaches, and passengers thrown into the wild landscape. Many stagecoach drivers lived their lives with an ever-present sense of anxiety, aware that the next journey might be their last. Yet, despite these dangers, many stagecoach drivers remained undeterred. They were the lifeline between towns, carrying people, goods, and mail, and connecting isolated communities to the wider world. They were vital to the expansion of the American West, helping to move people and resources across vast distances. Though often forgotten in the larger tales of the frontier, stagecoach drivers were essential to the fabric of life in the West. They were, in many ways, the unsung heroes who ensured that the wheels of the expanding frontier turned smoothly, even if it meant putting their own lives at risk. As you sit by the fire and listen to the wind rustling through the trees, think about the stagecoach drivers of the Wild West. Their lives were shaped by constant risk, uncertainty, and a fierce determination to fulfill their duty. They lived on the edge of safety, knowing that with every mile, danger could strike, yet they carried on, forging the paths that others would follow. As the fire's warmth fades into the cool, quiet night, you can almost feel the ground shifting beneath you, the landscape of the Wild West changing with each passing day. The land that once seemed endless, untouched, and free, was slowly being transformed by the arrival of a force more powerful than any outlaw or cattle drive: railroads. The hum of a locomotive, the rhythm of the wheels on the track, was becoming the new heartbeat of the West, a steady pulse that promised connection, progress, and for some, great wealth. Imagine yourself standing by the railroad tracks as the sound of an approaching train grows louder, the ground vibrating beneath your feet. The train is an embodiment of the modern age, a symbol of the rapid transformation happening all around you. The rails stretch out into the horizon, curving around mountains, cutting through deserts, and crossing rivers, making the once immense distances of the West seem smaller and more accessible. The railroad was the lifeblood of the frontier, and its expansion was the catalyst for the sweeping changes that would reshape the landscape, both physically and economically. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was one of the greatest feats of engineering in the 19th century. It connected the East Coast to the West Coast, linking the country from sea to shining sea. The promise of easier travel, quicker transportation of goods, and the potential for new cities and towns to spring up along the tracks sparked a frenzy of activity and investment. Cities like San Francisco, Denver, and Salt Lake City began to thrive, their growth fueled by the promise of the railroad, which brought settlers, businesses, and industries to places once considered too remote to be of any value. But the construction of the railroad was not without its toll. The labor force that built the tracks was made up of thousands of workers, many of whom were immigrants from China and Ireland, whose labor was exploited in exchange for meager wages. They worked in harsh, dangerous conditions, battling the elements and the unforgiving terrain. Mountains had to be tunneled through, vast stretches of desert had to be crossed, and rivers had to be bridged, all with limited resources and a constant pressure to complete the work as quickly as possible. These workers faced not only the physical challenges of their labor but also the hostility and prejudice of many settlers who resented their presence. The Chinese workers, in particular, faced discrimination and were often seen as expendable, a perception that would haunt them long after the railroad was completed. Yet, despite the hardships, they persevered, laying down the tracks that would carry the engines of progress and change across the continent. The impact of the railroad on the Wild West was profound. It opened up new markets for goods, providing farmers and ranchers with access to larger populations, and allowing Eastern manufacturers to send products westward. But the railroad also brought its own set of challenges, particularly in terms of the environment. The land that had once been open and free was now divided by the steel tracks, and the railroads became both a symbol of progress and a symbol of the loss of the old ways. The arrival of the railroad marked the beginning of the end for the cowboy and the open range. The vast, untamed spaces of the West were no longer the domain of free-roaming cattle and wandering cowboys. Fences were erected, towns sprang up along the tracks, and the frontier began to close. As the railroad expanded, it brought with it the forces of civilization, government, law, commerce, that would reshape the Wild West into a more ordered and structured place. The rugged independence that had defined the cowboy and the outlaw was being replaced by the inevitability of progress. Yet, for all the change the railroad brought, it also opened up new opportunities for the people of the West. It brought settlers looking to stake their claims, it brought towns and cities to life, and it brought new connections between the isolated regions of the country. The railroad symbolized both the end of one era and the beginning of another, one where the Wild West was no longer so wild, but instead was becoming a part of a larger, more interconnected world. As you sit by the fire, listening to the soft sounds of the night, think about the trains that began to roll across the West, carrying people, goods, and dreams. The expansion of the railroad forever changed the land, and with it, the people who had called it home. It was a time of upheaval, a time of progress, and a time that would forever leave its mark on the history of the American West. As the last embers of the fire glow softly, a quiet realization begins to settle in. The cowboy, that iconic figure of the Wild West, so often romanticized in songs, stories, and films, was, in reality, a man shaped by hardship and uncertainty. His life was not one of endless adventure under the open sky, but of grueling labor, constant struggle, and in many cases, disillusionment. The cowboy dream, so often touted as one of freedom and opportunity, was built on a fragile foundation, and as time passed, that dream began to crumble. Picture yourself, once a young man full of ambition, arriving in the West with nothing but your horse and a rifle. The land stretches before you, endless and full of promise. You are a cowboy, free to roam, free to live your life on your own terms. The freedom of the open range calls to you, and for a while, it seems like a dream come true. But as you begin to settle into the rhythm of cowboy life, the harsh realities of the job begin to unfold. The long cattle drives that were once viewed as an adventure quickly become a monotonous, exhausting grind. Each day blurs into the next, hot, dusty, and endless. The cattle must be moved from one grazing area to the next, and with every step, you feel the weight of the land on your shoulders. You ride for hours, sometimes days, with little more than the horizon to guide you. There are few comforts, few moments of reprieve. The work is physically demanding, the hours long, and the pay meager. And then there's the loneliness. Out on the range, you are far from family, friends, and any semblance of civilization. The only company you have is the other cowboys you ride with, and even then, it's clear that your relationships are based more on necessity than camaraderie. The isolation weighs heavily on your heart, and the dream of freedom that once seemed so enticing now feels more like a trap. The days stretch on, each one bringing more of the same, more dust, more long hours, and more exhaustion. As the years go by, the cowboy's life grows even more uncertain. The open range is shrinking, fenced in by farmers and landowners who no longer allow the cattle to roam freely. The rise of the railroad, the expansion of settlements, and the growing influence of the government have all played their part in closing off the vast, untamed spaces that once defined the cowboy's world. The cattle drives, once the heart of cowboy life, are becoming less common. The frontier that was once wild and full of possibility is now being tamed, and the cowboy, it seems, is being left behind. The promise of freedom, of a life lived on your own terms, is no longer viable. You can feel it, deep in your bones, the slow death of the cowboy way of life. The reality is that the land is being divided, and the cowboy is losing his place in it. Ranching is becoming more commercialized, and the small, independent cowboy is being pushed aside by larger operations and more modern methods. The dream of riding across endless plains, free and untethered, is becoming just that, a dream. And so you begin to wonder, what was it all for? The struggle, the endless days on the trail, the danger, the isolation, all for a way of life that is slipping away. The cowboy dream, once so full of promise, is fading, and the realization begins to settle in. The West you dreamed of is disappearing. The life you imagined is no longer possible, and the future feels uncertain. For many cowboys, the end came not in a dramatic showdown, but in quiet surrender. Some turned to farming or settled in towns, trying to make a life in the rapidly changing world. Others drifted away, their dreams broken, their spirits worn thin by the unrelenting grind of life on the frontier. The cowboy way of life was not one that could endure forever. It was, as it always had been, a way of living on the edge, and in the end, that edge wore away. As you sit by the fire, listening to the whispers of the night wind, think about the cowboys who lived and died by this dream. They weren't just men of the open range. They were men shaped by the land, by hardship, and by the slow, inevitable pull of change. The dream of the cowboy faded as the West was tamed, but the stories of their struggles and their perseverance continue to echo through the history of the American frontier. As the night deepens, the stillness of the air contrasts with the bustling chaos of life in the Wild West. The frontier, once a land of untamed freedom, began to fill with towns, cities, and establishments. places where civilization took root, but often in the most unruly of ways. In these towns, lawlessness flourished, and order was a fragile, often fleeting thing. The Wild West, for all its promise of opportunity, was a place where crime and violence were as much a part of daily life as the sunrise. Imagine yourself walking down a dusty street in one of these towns, a place like Tombstone, Dodge City, or Deadwood. The heat of the day lingers in the air, and the sound of boots clopping on the wooden planks of the sidewalk echoes in the quiet. Ahead, you can see a saloon, its doors swinging lazily, with laughter and shouting spilling out into the street. But beneath the surface, there's an undercurrent of tension. This town, like so many others, is a place where the law is often stretched thin, and sometimes, it doesn't exist at all. In the early days of the frontier, towns were built quickly, and their growth was often chaotic. The law was far away, and in many places there was little infrastructure to support a formal legal system. The sheriff, when there was one, had little authority and even less manpower. Sometimes, the only authority was the powerful figure who could keep a group of rowdy men under control, whether that was through fear, respect, or brute strength. This created a vacuum, a place where criminals, drifters, and outlaws could thrive. The absence of a strong legal system meant that disputes were often settled through violence. Arguments over land, ownership, and even personal grievances could quickly escalate into shootouts in the street, with little to no consequence for those involved. A single fight in the saloon could lead to death, and the next morning, the town might have moved on as if nothing had happened. Gambling was rampant in these towns, with saloons offering more than just drinks and entertainment. In the back rooms, there were high-stakes poker games, where fortunes could be won and lost in an instant. The house always had the advantage, but for many men, it was the only hope they had of making a fortune. But gambling also led to disputes, and when a man lost everything, there was nothing to stop him from drawing his gun and demanding the money back, or simply taking it. In these environments, the line between right and wrong became blurred. Outlaws and criminals didn't always wear the badge of villainy. Sometimes they were men who had fallen on hard times, forced into a life of crime to survive. Others, like the infamous cowboys, were simply doing what was necessary in a world where the law could be bought, bent, or ignored. But for every outlaw, there were those who tried to enforce the law, the local sheriff, a man often struggling with his own doubts and limitations. The rise of lawlessness was not confined to the criminals. The towns themselves, in their attempt to control the chaos, often resorted to extreme measures. Vigilante justice was common in frontier towns, where a group of townspeople would take matters into their own hands, bypassing any formal trial or judgment. They acted quickly, sometimes even violently, to deal with criminals. If a man was accused of wrongdoing, his fate was often sealed by a group of angry citizens, who saw themselves as the true defenders of law and order. But these vigilantes didn't always bring justice. Sometimes, they simply brought more violence, punishing men who might not have been guilty at all. This cycle of retribution created an environment where justice was not always fair, and the law was something that could be molded by whoever had the most power or influence at the time. In the midst of all this lawlessness, there were moments of clarity, moments when the law did take hold. But those moments were rare and fleeting. For most people living in these towns, the Wild West wasn't just about the freedom to roam. It was about the freedom to do whatever they wanted, without consequence. It was a place where survival depended on who you knew, how fast you could draw, and how much you were willing to fight for what you wanted. As the fire burns low, think on this. The Wild West wasn't simply a place of adventure and opportunity. It was also a place of lawlessness, where rules were fluid and often non-existent. In these towns, violence was as natural as the wind blowing across the plains, and justice was something that was often left up to the whim of those with the strength to enforce it. In the end, the Wild West wasn't just tamed by the law. It was shaped by the very chaos and disorder that made it legendary. As the flickering embers of the fire cast their last shadows, imagine yourself in a dusty frontier town, a place where the law was a distant, often impractical concept. There were no police stations, no formal courts, and certainly no public defenders. Justice in the Wild West was something much more immediate, something that occurred in the streets, in makeshift courtrooms, or not at all. The frontier justice system was raw, unrefined, and often as unpredictable as the land itself. The idea of justice in the Wild West was a simple one. It was about survival. In a land where law enforcement was scarce and far away, the local townspeople had to rely on themselves to maintain order. The first line of defense was often the town sheriff, but his authority was limited by the size of the town, his resources, and the power of the individuals within it. A sheriff often had to balance the needs of the community with the personal agendas of those who could influence him. In many cases, the sheriff was just as likely to be involved in the disputes as to solve them. The job itself was riddled with complications. A sheriff's responsibility was not only to uphold the law, but also to maintain the fragile peace between the miners, farmers, cattle ranchers, and various others trying to make a living in the West. The sheriff had few tools at his disposal, he wasn't always armed, and his position was often tenuous. Many times, a sheriff couldn't rely on backup from law enforcement, and had to settle conflicts with only a few trusted men by his side. When crime did occur, there was no formal trial or jury to preside over the case. Most disputes were settled quickly, often in the form of a violent showdown. The townspeople would act as judge, jury, and executioner, especially in cases involving theft, murder, or personal vendettas. The results were often swift and final: a hanging, a gunfight in the street, or, in some cases, a simple beating or exile. For crimes involving outlaws or high-stakes robberies, however, things were a bit different. The law of the frontier was deeply entwined with the customs of violence and retribution, often leading to vigilantism. When someone broke the law, the locals didn't wait for a trial. Justice was met immediately, and often brutally. In many cases, the outlaws were simply hunted down by anyone who wanted to earn the bounty on their head, or by a posse formed by those who had been wronged. The manhunt for an outlaw could quickly turn into a public spectacle, where the town rallied together to capture or eliminate the criminal. But not all forms of frontier justice were so overtly violent. Some towns did establish rudimentary systems of law. A local judge, often a wealthy landowner or successful businessman, would preside over cases in a town hall or even in the saloon. These trials were far from impartial, and the outcomes were often influenced by the social and political status of those involved. A wealthy rancher, for example, was much more likely to be acquitted of a crime than a poor miner or farmer, no matter the evidence. These makeshift courts often followed their own set of rules, often not so much about fairness, but about what served the community's needs at the time. People knew that justice could be slow and unpredictable, and they also knew that if they wanted to protect themselves, they needed to be prepared to take action on their own terms. The idea of a fair trial was often something that had to be earned through personal power or influence rather than something guaranteed by the legal system. For those who couldn't afford to pay for the protection of the wealthy or the powerful, frontier justice could be harsh. The justice system was often a reflection of the brutal and unforgiving nature of the Wild West itself. There was no room for leniency, and few opportunities for a fair second chance. In fact, many of the Wild West's most famous criminals were often heroes to the locals who saw them as symbols of resistance against a government they viewed as distant or corrupt. But what happened when the dust settled, and the violence receded? What happens when lawlessness finally catches up to a man, when his past cannot be outrun? Some criminals faded into the shadows, their legacies erased as quickly as they had come. Others, like Billy the Kid or Butch Cassidy, became figures of legend, an enduring testament to the lawless spirit of the West. The real cost of frontier justice was not just the lives lost in gunfights or lynchings, but the toll it took on the very idea of law itself. What justice meant in the Wild West wasn't about due process or equal rights, but about what could be done in a world where survival was a daily challenge. So as the fire crackles and the shadows of the night begin to stretch out, think about the justice of the Wild West, the justice of the frontier. It was a system that existed not to protect, but to control, to enforce survival in a land where laws were only as strong as the hands that could hold a gun. The Wild West was never a place of clear right and wrong. It was a place where justice was as wild as the land itself. As the fire's warmth begins to fade, the quiet of the night creeps in, and you might find your thoughts drifting to the complex and often contradictory relationships that define the Wild West. The story of the frontier is often told through the lens of lawmen and outlaws, good versus bad, but the truth is rarely so simple. The lives of sheriffs and outlaws were often more intertwined than we realize, shaped by circumstance, necessity, and the harsh realities of a world in constant flux. Imagine yourself walking through a dusty street in a frontier town, your boots kicking up the earth as you pass by the saloon, the livery stable, and the local sheriff's office. The air is thick with dust, and the heat of the day still lingers on. The sheriff, in his office, looks over the town with weary eyes. His badge, once a symbol of authority, now feels like a heavy weight, something to be carried through long, sleepless nights. He's not just the enforcer of the law. He's a man struggling with the same chaos that has gripped the town. The line between lawman and outlaw is often thinner than it seems. Take, for example, the famous story of Frank and Jesse James. These notorious outlaws, celebrated for their daring bank robberies and dramatic escapes, were once considered heroes by many of the common folk. They came from a family that had deep roots in the struggle for survival on the frontier, where violence was a means of survival, not always a choice. The James brothers, in their younger years, were part of a bitter conflict during the Civil War, and their actions during and after the war were often seen as a form of resistance against what they perceived as an oppressive government. Their robberies were not always about greed, but about a desire to reclaim some measure of power in a world where they had lost so much. The sheriff, who might be tasked with bringing these men to justice, was no stranger to the same world. He wasn't always a figure of unquestioned authority. In many cases, sheriffs themselves had once been outlaws, or had friends who lived on the other side of the law. In fact, some sheriffs were former criminals who had turned to law enforcement as a way of escaping their past or making a living. The line between right and wrong was often blurred. In towns where law enforcement was a rare commodity, those in positions of authority often had to rely on old allegiances, personal ties, or, at times, a willingness to look the other way. This relationship between sheriffs and outlaws wasn't just about sympathy or shared histories. It was about survival. Outlaws, after all, didn't operate in a vacuum. They were shaped by the same brutal realities of frontier life, driven by the need to survive, often in a world where the law was distant, ineffective, or outright corrupt. They were, in many ways, a product of the same system that the sheriff was trying to uphold. Consider the notorious figure of Wyatt Earp. His name is often synonymous with law and order, thanks in part to his role in the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. But Earp's life was more complex than the simple story of a lawman fighting against outlaws. He spent much of his time in frontier towns, gambling, drinking, and even engaging in activities that were far from above reproach. His story is intertwined with those of the men he was trying to bring to justice. Earp himself was not a stranger to the same lawlessness that permeated the land. His life as a lawman was more about balance and survival than enforcing ideals of justice. This connection between lawmen and outlaws goes beyond just shared experiences. It was often a matter of mutual respect. Outlaws, for all their criminal activities, sometimes had a code, a set of rules they followed, even in their lawlessness. In turn, sheriffs and lawmen were often aware of the nuances of the criminal world, understanding the men they were chasing and knowing their strengths, weaknesses, and strategies. A sheriff who respected an outlaw might turn a blind eye to certain transgressions, while an outlaw might hesitate to cross the line into violence against the lawman. In the end, the relationship between sheriffs and outlaws was more than just a struggle for control. It was a struggle for survival in a land that had little room for weakness. The Wild West was a place where the law was not a guaranteed protector of order, but a fragile, often temporary construct that existed only as long as the balance between power and chaos was maintained. As you sit quietly by the fire, think about the complexity of these relationships. The sheriffs, who were not always the heroes they were portrayed to be, and the outlaws, who were not always the villains of legend. They were men and women trying to navigate a world where the rules were not clear, where justice was not always black and white, and where survival meant making choices that were not always easy. As the night presses deeper into its stillness, you might feel a certain quietude fill the air, a tranquility that contrasts sharply with the violent history that once filled these lands. The Wild West, in its romanticized form, is often told through the eyes of settlers, cowboys, and outlaws. Yet beneath this larger narrative lies a profound, often hidden struggle: the Comanche Wars, a series of battles fought by the Comanche people to protect their homeland and their way of life from the ever-encroaching settlers and the U.S. military. Imagine yourself standing on the high plains of what would become Texas, the wind sweeping across the open land, stirring the dry grass at your feet. The horizon stretches endlessly before you, and somewhere in that expanse, the Comanche, known as the Lords of the Plains, are organizing, strategizing, and preparing for the battle ahead. Their lives, their culture, and their sovereignty were in peril, and they were willing to fight to protect them. The Comanche were not a single, unified tribe in the way that many people imagine when they think of Native Americans. Rather, they were a group of highly skilled, warrior-based tribes that roamed across vast territories, stretching from the Great Plains down to the northern reaches of Mexico. Their society was structured around a strong sense of kinship and a deep respect for the land and animals. They were known for their exceptional horsemanship and their ability to wage guerrilla-style warfare, using the terrain and their knowledge of the land to outmaneuver much larger forces. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Comanche were a dominant force in the region. They controlled trade routes, raided settlers and soldiers alike, and fought fiercely to maintain their independence. However, with the ever-growing presence of the U.S. government and the wave of settlers pushing westward, their way of life was under threat. By the time the U.S. military began its campaigns against the Comanche, they were already entrenched in a battle not just for land, but for their very existence. The Comanche Wars were not the traditional large-scale battles that we often associate with frontier conflict. Instead, they were a series of skirmishes, raids, and small-scale ambushes. The Comanche were experts at using hit-and-run tactics, attacking military outposts, isolated settler families, and supply trains. They targeted the weak points in the settlers' defenses, using speed, surprise, and the terrain to their advantage. The U.S. military, with its large-scale formations and reliance on established tactics, was often caught off guard by the speed and brutality of the Comanche attacks. The wars were brutal on both sides. The U.S. military, in its attempts to subdue the Comanche, resorted to the use of overwhelming force. Forts were built, troops were sent, and violent campaigns were launched to wipe out the Comanche resistance. One of the most infamous of these campaigns was led by Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie in the 1870s, who eventually succeeded in breaking the Comanches' will by destroying their food sources and forcing them into submission. Yet, despite the immense pressure they faced, the Comanche did not surrender easily. Their resistance was not just about defending land, but about preserving their culture, their families, and their way of life. For them, the land was sacred, and their very identity was tied to the freedom of the plains. The harshness of their resistance became one of the defining aspects of the conflict, earning them the respect of both their enemies and allies alike. But the Comanches' fight was ultimately a losing battle. By the late 1870s, their way of life had been shattered. The U.S. military and the expansion of settlers had driven them to the brink of extinction. Their lands were taken, their buffalo herds were slaughtered, and their warriors were either killed or captured. The once proud nomadic people were forced onto reservations, where their culture and traditions were slowly undermined. Despite their defeat, the legacy of the Comanche people endures. Their story is one of fierce independence, survival, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. They were not just victims of colonization, but active participants in shaping the history of the West. Their battles, though largely invisible in mainstream narratives, represent the larger struggle of many indigenous peoples during the expansion of the United States. As the night draws on and the stars appear above, think on this. The Comanche Wars were not just a chapter in the story of the Wild West, but a story of survival and defiance in a time of relentless change. The Comanche, like so many other indigenous peoples, fought not just for land, but for their culture, their families, and their future. Though the battles may be long over, their legacy remains in the land and the stories passed down through generations. As the night deepens around you, the fire now little more than glowing embers, a new perspective begins to emerge, one that is often overshadowed by the tales of American cowboys and their adventures. Yet, alongside them, there were the Mexican cowboys, or vaqueros, whose influence on the cowboy way of life is often overlooked. Their legacy was deeply woven into the fabric of ranching in the American West, and their struggles, just as real, just as demanding, are integral to the history of the frontier. Imagine yourself standing in a vast, sun-bleached landscape, the scent of earth and grass in the air. To one side, cattle graze peacefully beneath a wide, open sky. The land is both beautiful and brutal, an unforgiving expanse that seems to stretch on forever. The vaquero, the Mexican cowboy, rides alongside his American counterparts, but his life, shaped by both the Spanish and indigenous cultures of the Southwest, is distinct in its own right. The vaqueros were the original cattle herders of the West, with their traditions stretching back to the early days of Spanish colonization in the 16th century. When the Spanish arrived, they brought with them horses, cattle, and the traditions of ranching, skills that the indigenous peoples of the region quickly adopted and adapted. Over time, vaqueros became experts in the management of livestock, developing techniques that would later be passed down to the American cowboys who came to dominate the ranching world. But for all their expertise, the lives of vaqueros were often marked by hardship and struggle. The vast ranches, or haciendas, that dotted the American Southwest were worked by vaqueros, many of whom were Mexican, though others were of Native American or mixed descent. These ranches were typically controlled by wealthy landowners, often Anglo settlers who had moved west in search of their own fortunes. For the vaqueros, this meant working long hours under harsh conditions, herding cattle, mending fences, and maintaining the ranch while receiving little in return for their labor. Unlike their American counterparts, the vaqueros had little chance of striking it rich. Their work was steady but unglamorous, and they were often subjected to grueling tasks that left little room for rest. They worked in searing heat, with little more than their hat and their horse to protect them from the sun. And despite their vital role in the ranching economy, they were often treated as second-class citizens, overlooked by both the wealthy ranch owners and the emerging American cowboy culture. The vaqueros were also caught between two worlds. The arrival of American settlers and the expansion of the United States meant that their traditional ways of life were constantly being threatened. The rise of American-style ranching and the increasing dominance of Anglo settlers meant that the vaqueros were being pushed aside. The land they once roamed freely was now being fenced in, and the work they had done for centuries was being taken over by others. At the same time, the U.S. government's policies towards Mexican and Native American communities, particularly in the post-Civil War period, began to undermine the rights of vaqueros. The promise of land grants and legal rights that had been extended to Mexican settlers was often ignored or rescinded, leaving vaqueros without the land they had worked for generations. Even as they continued to work the land for the benefit of others, they found themselves dispossessed of their homes, their livestock, and their livelihoods. Yet, despite these challenges, the vaqueros remained resilient. Their cultural legacy lived on in their distinctive style of horsemanship, in their rodeo traditions, and in the very way cattle were managed across the West. The term, cowboy, itself is derived from the Spanish vaquero, and many of the tools and techniques used by American cowboys were learned from the vaqueros, from the lasso to the saddle, to the way cattle were branded and cared for. While the vaqueros never achieved the legendary status that their American counterparts did, their influence on ranch life in the West was undeniable. They were the first true cowboys of the region, and their work laid the foundation for the cowboy culture that would dominate the American West. They taught the American cowboys how to herd cattle, how to ride, and how to survive in the harsh conditions of the frontier. Yet, for all their contributions, the vaqueros were often forgotten, their struggles erased from the larger narrative of the Wild West. As the fire burns low, think about the vaqueros, the Mexican cowboys whose lives were filled with struggle, hardship, and perseverance. Their legacy may not have been celebrated in the same way as the American cowboy, but it is just as integral to the story of the West. They were the unsung heroes of the frontier, shaping the world of ranching and cowboys with their expertise and their strength. As the night air grows cooler, you might feel a certain weight in the quiet around you. The flickering of the fire's last embers brings to mind one of the most iconic events in Wild West history, a showdown that has been immortalized in countless stories and films. It's a moment that many associate with the Wild West, the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral. It was a battle between lawmen and outlaws, a dramatic clash that became the stuff of legend. But as with many aspects of frontier life, the reality of that showdown was far less glamorous and far more complicated than the tales suggest. Imagine yourself standing in the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona, in 1881. The heat is oppressive, and the air is thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. You can hear the distant clink of spurs and the rhythmic pounding of boots on the hard-packed dirt. The town is on edge. The tensions between the Earp brothers and the Clanton and McClory families, two groups known for their violent ways, have been building for weeks. The OK Corral, a modest stable in town, is the setting for a confrontation that would echo through history. The gunfight itself was brief, lasting only about 30 seconds, but its implications would resonate for years to come. It was not the dramatic, slow-motion duel often depicted in Hollywood films. Instead, it was chaotic, unpredictable, and violent, a result of escalating tensions and personal grudges between men who lived by their own rules, not the law. The Earps, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, along with Doc Holliday, were the lawmen. On the other side were the Clantons and McClorys, who were considered outlaws by many. In the days leading up to the showdown, the two sides had engaged in verbal spats, and the tension had escalated, with accusations of rustling cattle, theft, and threats of violence hanging in the air. A confrontation seemed inevitable, and the inevitable came on October 26, 1881. As you stand in the middle of the dusty street, the sound of boots draws nearer. The two groups come face to face, their hands hovering near their guns. It's a tense moment, with no turning back. And then, the gunfire erupts, fast, loud, and deafening. In the blink of an eye, men are shot, some mortally wounded. The dust rises in the chaos, and what was once a small town, with its bars, saloons, and people just trying to get by, now finds itself forever changed by this sudden burst of violence. When the smoke clears, 3 men are dead, Tom and Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton. Virgil, Morgan, and Wyatt Earp, along with Doc Holliday, walk away from the gunfight, but not unscathed. The consequences of that moment are far-reaching. The violence doesn't end here. In fact, it marks the beginning of a brutal vendetta, with the Earps seeking retribution for the deaths of their brothers, and the entire town now divided by the specter of revenge. The story of the OK Corral is often told as a tale of clear-cut good versus evil, the lawmen, who stand for order, against the outlaws, who stand for chaos. But in truth, the situation was much murkier. The Earps, for all their reputation as upholders of the law, were not entirely innocent. They had their own history of violence and lawlessness, and they operated on their own sense of justice, one that didn't always align with the law as it was written. The McClorys and Clantons, on the other hand, were seen as outlaws by some, but to others, they were simply men trying to survive in a lawless land. The aftermath of the gunfight would shape Tombstone's future. The town would be left to deal with the violence, the grief, and the consequences of a confrontation that never had a clear resolution. The legendary status of the OK Corral fight doesn't come from its outcome, it comes from its symbolic nature. It represents the Wild West itself, a place where rules were often unclear, where justice was determined by those with power, and where violence could erupt without warning, changing everything in a moment. As you sit by the fire, listening to the quiet of the night, think on this. The OK Corral is not just about a gunfight. It's about a way of life, a way of thinking that defined the Wild West, where honor, justice, and survival were decided not by courts or lawmakers, but by the people themselves, in the blink of an eye. The story of that fateful day is a reminder of the violence and uncertainty that shaped the frontier, a violence that, for all its legendary status, was far more common than we like to imagine. As the fire burns low, its embers now glowing softly in the quiet of the night, a sense of reflection lingers in the air. The story of the Wild West, the cattle drives, the outlaws, the cowboys and vaqueros, the towns built on lawlessness, was always going to be a fleeting moment in history. The very land that once seemed limitless and full of untapped promise was being reshaped by forces that no one could hold back. The frontier, wild and untamed as it was gradually being closed, replaced by the growing certainty of a new, modern America. Imagine yourself standing on a hill, gazing out over the landscape that was once dominated by the open plains, free to roam, unbounded by fences or railroads. The horizon, once endless and full of potential, now seems smaller, more contained. The land has been tamed, by railroads, by ranches, by towns, by laws. The rugged independence of the cowboy is giving way to the orderly lines of civilization, as cities rise and the law takes a firmer hold. The days of roaming the frontier freely, without boundaries, are slipping away. The closing of the frontier is often marked by the establishment of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which physically connected the east to the west, bringing with it settlers, industry, and change. The railroads carved up the land, linking it together but also cutting off the free-flowing nature of the west. The once vast, open range where cattle roamed freely and cowboys rode across untamed terrain was shrinking, replaced by fenced-in plots of land and bustling towns and cities that sprang up along the tracks. The railroads were both a symbol of progress and a sign of the end of the old frontier, where people could live without much oversight. Alongside the railroads came the rise of modern industries, farming, mining, and ranching, all becoming more organized and commercialized. The days of small, independent ranchers were dwindling. Larger companies took control of the land, consolidating power, and turning the Wild West into a place of business rather than a place of adventure. The cowboy, once the embodiment of freedom and self-reliance, was now part of a system that was driven by profit and industry. But the transformation wasn't just economic, it was cultural. The West, once a place of lawlessness and possibility, began to be governed by institutions that mirrored the East. The establishment of police forces, courts, and schools gradually brought a sense of order, replacing the chaotic, unpredictable nature of life on the frontier. The Native American tribes, once fiercely independent and the original stewards of the land, were systematically removed from their ancestral territories, forced onto reservations, and their cultures faced obliteration as assimilation policies took hold. With the end of the frontier came the rise of a different kind of American identity, one shaped by industrial progress, urban growth, and the rise of corporations. The era of the Wild West, full of rugged individualism, fierce independence, and violent confrontations, began to fade as the country turned its eyes to the future. It was in America where the cowboy spirit was romanticized in stories and films, but not one that could survive in the rapidly changing world of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet, even as the frontier closed, its legacy endured. The cowboy's image, the outlaw's mystique, and the sense of freedom and opportunity that characterized the early days of the West became ingrained in the American consciousness. The Wild West, in its raw and chaotic form, continued to live on in stories, in the hearts of those who longed for the freedom of the open range, and in the films and books that romanticized its past. But now, as you sit quietly in the night, consider this: the Wild West is no longer a place on the map. It is a symbol, a memory, a dream of a time when America was still in its infancy, when the land was wide open, and every man and woman could carve out their own destiny. The end of the frontier marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would lead America into the modern era, with cities, factories, and roads that connected people in ways never before imagined. The Wild West, with its outlaws and cowboys, is gone, but the spirit of that time lives on, not just in myths and legends, but in the very foundation of what America would become, a land of possibilities shaped by the past, but ever reaching toward the future.